Having explored the Anglican ethos as it has been articulated within these Caroline divines, I want to now turn to two figures, both poets, both preachers, both churchmen, both Reformed thinkers, John Donne and George Herbert. The title of this section of the lecture is Reformed Theology in an Experiential Mode. Donne and Herbert were both well within the broad limits of Reformed theology. Both were probably moderately Calvinistic theologians. Both were happily content with the official Reformed theology of the Church of England in this post-Elizabethan church. Both, however, sought to go beyond merely articulating Reformed theology in the process of making the finer distinctions within theological treatises. Both rather experientially grappled with the more perplexing doctrines of Reformed theology. And indeed, there were very perplexing doctrines taught by Reformed theology. Reformed theology would tell you that you have a will that is bound to sin, and therefore by your own efforts you cannot profitably turn yourself to God however much you want to. Reformed theology would teach you that you were totally depraved, which means that every aspect of your human nature was vitiated by sin, such that you could not now, by your own efforts, make a movement toward God, however much you wanted to. Furthermore, Reformed theology would say that the righteousness by which you are accepted by God is not any righteousness that characterizes who you actually are or how you actually behave, but rather is an alien righteousness credited to your account in imputation. Furthermore, Reformed theology would say the fact that you are now in Christ is not a result of some movement your will has made toward God, originating from within you, but rather is God's gracious election of you from before time in predestination. Furthermore, Reformed theology would say you can have Christian assurance, but this assurance is not based on anything that you have done. It is rather that which comes to you as you look outside of yourself to Christ and cling only to what He has done on behalf of you. And so it seems as if Reformed theology at every turn is pointing the Christian beyond his or her own experience and pointing rather to the sovereign work of God on your behalf. Because what is it that characterizes me as a Christian in and of myself? Well, that's sin, a bound will, and I am in and of myself totally depraved, which means I must look to Christ outside of me as the sovereign grace of God coming to me. Now, it's one thing to articulate this in a theology. It's another to know how it is that I live my Christian life and undergo various Christian experiences in light of these doctrines, which can be perplexing and paradoxical. What we see in Donne and Herbert is a kind of experiential appropriation, or better yet, an experiential grappling with these more perplexing elements of Reformed theology. In order to show what I mean by this, I'd like to look at three poems, two by Donne. First would be his famous Batter My Heart, Three-Person God, followed by a hymn to God the Father. And then I want to look at a poem called Love 3 by George Herbert. And what we'll see as we go through these poems is that they are grappling with various high doctrines of Reformed theology, such as the bound will and total depravity and predestination and assurance, perseverance of the saints. Again, in in Herbert, total depravity, as well as the doctrine of imputation. What we'll see is that they take these very high theological points and they work them into the Christian's experience such that these doctrines are not merely understood within the mind, but are actually understood now by the heart. Well, let's turn first to John Donne's famous holy sonnet, Batter My Heart, Three-Person God. It would perhaps help if you had your notes in front of you so that you could look at this poem as I read through it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through it, but pause at various points in order to make comments upon it. And I'm going to fight the urge to just turn into an English teacher and point out all of the brilliant poetic conceits and figures of speech that are part of Donne's elocution, and focus as much as I can on the theological themes that are developed, but I'll probably point out some of the beautiful conceits as well. Batter My Heart, Three-Person God is one of Donne's holy sonnets. In this poem, he explores the doctrines of the bound will. That is, the will is so thoroughly bound to sin that by our own efforts we cannot turn to God, and we cannot accept Him however much we want to. We may see what we ought to do, but that doesn't mean we are able to do it. Again, total depravity is an aspect of this. The sinner who is totally depraved is utterly reliant upon the grace of God to break down the walls of resistance to God's grace. In that the breaking down of those walls cannot originate from within the sinner, because all of the aspects of the sinner's nature, mind, heart, will, are bound to sin according to this doctrine of total depravity. Therefore, if we are going to be saved, according to this, we must have God's sovereign action come from outside and break down the walls of our resistance. And thus the doctrine of predestination, let's say, or of God's sovereign grace, let's say, could take a, let's say, violent mode. Insofar as it's necessary for the obstinance of our will to be overcome by God's greater and more powerful, gracious will. What is it like to experience all of this? This is what Donne is exploring within this poem. Batter my heart, three-personed God, for you as yet, but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend. Let me pause there. Donne is asking God to batter his heart, for he recognizes within his own heart a resistance to God, and he appeals to the three-person God. I once read a series of essays in college about this poem, exploring why Donne appealed to the three-personed God. At the very least, what I got from my afternoon in the library was that it amplifies the notion of God's sovereign power. He's a three-personed God, a trinity of power. So Donne says, batter my heart, three-person God, for you as yet but knock, like someone knocking on the door, breathing, a gentle breath, and shine, like a pleasant noonday sun. And you seek to mend. In other words, you seek to make whole. But Donne means something more than this gentle action of God on his behalf, seeking to mend him. And so he says, batter my heart. Break down the door. Stop knocking and break the door down. He goes on, that I may rise and stand or throw me, and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. So if I'm going to stand, if I'm going to rise and stand, you've got to overthrow me. Notice the paradoxical feature of this. If I am going to stand up, you've got to cast me down, because it is the obstinance the standing in my own will that is my problem. So break me down so that I can then stand up. And then he says, bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. So notice the three that we had earlier. Knock, breathe, shine, which are gentle, let's say, gentlemanly actions of God. Standing at the door and knocking, breathing as a gentle breath, shining like a pleasant sun. But rather than knock, breathe, shine, Dunn now transposes those three terms into a violent key. He says, don't knock, break. Don't breathe, blow like a hurricane. Don't shine, burn. Don't seek to mend, but rather make me new. I, like a usurped town to another do, labor to admit you, but oh, to no end. So Dunn now likens himself to a town that has been usurped and is now standing against the rightful ruler of the town. And Dunn goes to the gates and he tries to open up the gate to the rightful Lord, and yet, but to no end. He cannot. And this is the beginning of Dunn developing a sort of paradox. He desires to accept Christ. He desires to allow the grace of God in order to renew him. And yet, despite this desire for God's grace, he cannot actually receive God's grace. And so he feels divided against himself and trapped within himself. His affections divided, his will bound to sin, and yet his will longing for something other than sin, the grace of God. And so what Dunn seems to be doing here is exploring the boundaries of the doctrine of total depravity. It's possible to be totally depraved and thus utterly incapable of making a movement toward God, and yet within that very state there is nevertheless a desire, however ineffectual, for God's grace. Reason, your viceroy in me, should defend, but is captive and proves weak or untrue. So in his reason, indeed, even longs and knows the grace of God, and yet reason is captive along with the will and proves weak or perhaps untrue. Yet dearly I love you, and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Despite Dunn's inability and therefore unwillingness to open his heart and his life to the grace of God, nevertheless he confesses, dearly I love you. And so do you see the conflict within him? This is what it means to wrestle with total depravity, because total depravity doesn't mean we don't have any longing for God. It just means that we don't have any ability to make a positive movement toward God on the basis of that love, and therefore we need God's action upon us, breaking down the walls of our resistance. And yet, dearly I love you. He loves God, but he cannot act upon this love. Divorce me. Untie, break that knot again, take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me. So here Dunn heightens the paradox. He says, I'm betrothed to your enemy, so divorce me, untie me, and break that knot so that I can now be betrothed unto you. And I will never be free unless you enslave me. I will never be chaste unless you ravish me. So take me to you, imprison me, Dunn says. Otherwise I shall never be free, and I shall never be pure. So what many in Reformed theology would be led to with this doctrine of total depravity, as well as the doctrine of predestination, is talking about God's sovereign grace as if it is, so to speak, violently overcoming a human resistant will in order to save that human being, in order to save that sinner, violently overcoming that sinner's sinful heart. The paradox here, however, is that Dunn is requesting God to act violently upon his will, which means his will is already in some sense captured by the beauty of God's grace. Dunn says, dearly I would love you, and that love within his heart causes him to desire and request the violent action of God overcoming his own resistance. And if that's the case, is this really a violent overcoming of Dunn's will, or is it granting the sinner his deepest desire, which is to be loved by God? And of course, the poem simply ends with laying out those really violent kind of paradoxes without resolving them in one way or the other. But of course, this is what it's like to experience the aspects of this doctrine of total depravity and God's sovereign decision and predestination. We're left with a kind of tension between the human will that ineffectually longs for the grace of God and the grace of God that violently overcomes the resistance within our will, thus fulfilling our deepest desires for God. And Dunn goes no further to illuminate that paradox. He simply leaves it because that's part of what it means to experience as a Christian. Next poem we're going to look at is entitled A Hymn to God the Father. This hymn, you may have noticed, or this poem is found within the 1982 hymnal of the Episcopal Church, and so you may have sung this before. In this poem, Dunn grapples with the doctrines of assurance. How can I be sure of my salvation? As well as the doctrine, the Reformed doctrine of the perseverance of the saints, giving voice to his fear that his desire for God's grace might not last until the end of his life, and uttering that in a prayer to God. So again, let's go through this poem. I'm going to read it and pause at various points to comment upon it. But pay attention to how Dunn grapples with this doctrine of assurance, given the fact that he's exploring his own life for the various sins that would hamper the work of God within him. Wilt thou forgive that sin where I begun, which was my sin, though it were done before? What Dunn is asking here is, will you forgive those sins that I have committed in the past, which were my sins being done before? Will you forgive me for past sins? He goes on, wilt thou forgive that sin through which I run, and do run still, though still I do deplore? Here Dunn asks not whether you will forgive past sins, but will you forgive those sins that I am even now committing and even now running through? I deplore these sins, and yet even now I am committing them. Will you forgive sins that I am now, even now, in the process of committing? Those habitual sins that I even still have not conquered. Will you forgive present sins? Perhaps you've asked that in your own Christian life. We always want forgiveness for past sins. We would prefer that we first conquer the sin, and therefore showing God that we have conquered the sin with our heads held high, asking him for forgiveness. But we often have the more troubling thought that we have sins that are still conquering us, and we are in need not of forgiveness for past sins, but forgiveness for present sins that we are even now enthralled by. Will God forgive even present sins through which we still run? When thou hast done, thou hast not done, for I have more. Beautiful lines there. Keep in mind that this is a poem written by John Donne. So he says, when you're done forgiving me for those sins, you don't have done. In other words, you don't have me, for I still have more sins for which I need forgiveness. When thou hast done, thou hast not done, for I have more. So there's a classic Donne play on words, writing his own name into the poem. Second stanza. Wilt thou forgive that sin which I have won others to sin, and made my sins their door? That's even more difficult to ask forgiveness for. Those sins by which I have drawn others into sin, making my sin their door into their own sin. Will you forgive me for the sins by which I've won others to sin? Does God's forgiveness extend that far? Can I be sure of God's forgiveness for even those despicable sins? Do you see how Donne is amplifying the sin each time? It goes from past sins to present sins that now currently characterize our lives to sins by which I have caused others to sin. It gets worse and worse. Will you forgive for this? He goes on, wilt thou forgive that sin which I did shun a year or two, but wallowed in a score? There are times in our lives where we're able to resist sin for a time. But eventually that sin gets the best of us. We resisted it for a year or two, but then we wallow in it for 20 years. Will you forgive even that sin, those long-standing sins that have characterized our lives for decades? When thou hast done, thou hast not done, for I have more. I have a sin of fear, that when I've spun my last thread, I shall perish on the shore. Donne is giving voice to a sort of deeper sin, a sin of fear. A fear that, though he is now presently assured of God's grace, that grace will not last him until the end of his life, but that in fact he will turn away from God's grace, and thus, at the very end of his life, perish on the shore. How can he be assured of, in other words, future forgiveness? He's talked about past sins. He's talked about present sins. He's talked about sins by which he has caused others to sin. He's talked about long-standing sins that he has wallowed in a score. And now he's talking about future sins. The fear that he will perish on the shore after spinning his last thread. Will you forgive future sins? Do you see how this is a question of assurance extending into the future? How can I be sure of my perseverance? And the very fear that I won't persevere is indeed a sin itself. How can he be assured now, lost in this fear? Well, what would Reformed theology say he ought to do? What might Calvin, or what might Luther even, who's of course not a Reformed theologian per se, but what would a Luther say? Well, look beyond yourself and find your assurance in Christ who is outside of you. Notice what Donne does now. But swear by thyself that at my death thy sun shall shine as he shines now and heretofore. And having done that, thou hast done. I fear no more. So Donne grapples with all the various types of sin, bringing more and more despicable sins for God's examination, seeking assurance as he remembers these various sins and calls them to mind before God, finally bringing up that deep hidden sin of fear that in the end God will not accept him. And what is it that breaks him out of this impasse of the spirit, if not looking beyond himself and beyond his own experience being snatched away from his experience, as Luther would say, by saying, "Swear by thyself, O God, that at my death thy sun shall shine as he shines now and heretofore." When you've done that, you have done. For you have me, and I fear no more. Stunningly beautiful poem that speaks to each of us sinners who have to grapple with the question of assurance. Let's turn to George Herbert's poem, Love. Here Herbert, like Donne, wrestles with total depravity, the shame of the sinner, as well as the doctrine of imputation that takes us for righteous, even though we in and of ourselves are not righteous. Takes us as accepted in God, even though we in and ourselves are unacceptable and shameful creatures. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. So there's the invitation of love, but then one glance at the wickedness of our own hearts, of our own souls, we draw back because we recognize our unworthiness of the love that now invites us. Guilty of dust and sin. Dust is a recurring image within Herbert's poetry. Dust, of course, reminding us of the dust to which we shall return in death. But dust is that which also clouds our eyes and impairs our vision. So his soul draws back guilty of dust in sin. Well, he can't see clearly, but perhaps God can. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. "A guest," I answered, "worthy to be here." I don't lack anything except worthiness to even be here. Love said, "You shall be he." Notice the shall. You are not he currently. In fact, you are unworthy to be here, but you shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful, ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. There's something about this, the shame of sin that causes us to even avert our eyes and not want to look upon the holiness of God, but rather to turn back in upon ourselves in shame. Love took my hand, and smiling did reply, "Who made the eyes but I?" "Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve." Have you experienced that kind of shame that even though you know of God's desire to accept you, your shame causes you to rather want to depart from him in order to hide away those parts of you of which you are ashamed and guilty and would prefer to keep shrouded in darkness? It's a very distinct human feeling. I know you've experienced it. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. Okay, you've borne my blame, but okay, I will come into the banquet, but let me serve. We return to, this is like the prodigal son. It says, remember the speech he rehearses? I'm not worthy to be your son, but take me on as one of your hired servants. Let me serve. Let me pay back my own debt. And here we have sort of out of shame, we sort of recapitulate the original sin by which we are independent of God. Because if we can earn our way back, then we ourselves, by our own efforts, are doing away with our own shame and guilt. Let me serve. I'll come, but let me serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. And so I did sit and eat. Love will have nothing of you coming and earning your way back through service. Rather, love will simply have you sit and eat. So here we end with a strong command. You must sit down and taste my meat. No other argumentation is possible at this point. Love has accepted the poet, however sinful and shameful he is. The poet simply has to accept the fact that God, in his love, has accepted him. So here we have an exploration of, yes, total depravity, and yet how the depravity of our nature is no obstacle to God's love that takes us for righteous on the basis of Christ himself, who has borne the blame, and will brook no opposition, but simply says, sit and eat. And so we sit and eat. Well, 3 poems. You're reading many more, but I think these 3 poems stand out as especially beautiful ways of Donne and Herbert, who are within the mainstream of the Reformed tradition, nevertheless grapple with some of the harder edges of those perplexing doctrines of total depravity and a bound will and assurance and predestination, and God's seemingly, although perhaps not actually, violent breaking down of the walls of our resistance. All of this, they wrestle with it, and they produce not resolutions to these paradoxical doctrines, but rather an experiential grappling with those paradoxes, leaving the paradoxes ultimately unresolved intellectually, but within our own experience, deeply satisfying. Well, in the next section of the lecture, we'll turn to Jeremy Taylor and the Eucharistic sacrifice and see how at least one of these Caroline divines did seek to go beyond the Reformed doctrine of the Church of England and press the doctrine in a new direction. Till then.